Hey everybody, CO, and welcome back to Comics and Dragons. I'm Lance White Eagle, and today we are going to be kind of continuing our beginner's guide to Dungeons and Dragons by talking about dice. Now, for Dungeons and Dragons and other tabletop role-playing games, you use what are called polyhedral dice. These dice have actually been around a long time. They've found polyhedral dice, especially 20-sided dice, in excavations of ancient Egypt and ancient Rome. But in the 1960s, 70s, they became popular with miniature war games, and since that is what Dungeons and Dragons evolved out of, they carried over and started using these kind of peculiar dice sets. The original dice for Dungeons and Dragons, you had a mail off for, and they sent you a set of blank dice, and you had to number them yourselves. Now there's a multitude of companies that are producing sets of polyhedral dice. The most popular company is Chessex. Their dice come in little plastic containers like this. You can find those in any comic store or game store all over Amazon and other various online retailers. GameStop has also started carrying some dice from a different company that come in a little tube here. And you can also find specialty sets on different websites and such that come in nicer boxes, but they're generally all the same. So there's also a bunch of accessories that people get into with their dice sometimes, and collecting of them. There are people with hundreds of sets of dice of various colors and shapes and materials. We'll get more into that here in a second. You have things like dice trays, dice towers, dice bags, but none of that is really necessary. What you need to play is you need a set of dice, and to kind of know how they work and when to roll what. So we're going to switch over to the table and take a closer look at polyhedral dice and what they're used for Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, couple more quick things before we get into the individual die. You'll find a variety of different dice in a multitude of colors. That's all really just personal preference. You'll also find a large number of different materials that are used in the creation of polyhedral dice. You have kind of your standard, which is like this plastic resin. I'd say it's probably second most common are metal sets, which you can find in most hobby or game stores. These particular ones are from the Paladin Role Playing Company and Easy Roller Dice Company. There are also a large number of kind of specialty dice made out of a variety of different stones, gemstones, wood, glass, and those are just really personal preference. You'll see a couple different varieties of sets. The standard set has 6 or 7 dice in them, and you'll also find larger sets like this one that have 10 dice in them. Most of the 10 sets just have some extra d6s to make it more convenient for things like rolling your starting stats, which we'll talk about more in our creating your first character video. The dice also come in a variety of sizes. You have large sets, you have your standard size set, and you can also find miniature dice. And all that, again, really comes down to personal preference. One of the things I look for when I'm choosing a set of dice is ease of readability, and I think that is more important to people who have vision issues. You also, it's kind of worth noting that the layout of the numbers is typically standardized. You don't see it in all of the sets, but most common, any dice that you look at, especially for gambling things, have a set orientation of the numbers. And how the placement of the numbers is determined is one side of the die plus the inverse side should equal one greater than the maximum number of sides on that particular die. And that's not something you really need to know, just kind of a interesting little fact. Some people you'll hear talk about their dice weight, and if they're weighted properly, what that means is that each number has the same chance of coming up of any other number. With most of the major companies, this is something you'll never have to worry about. Some people do a salt and water solution and float their dice to kind of determine if they are properly balanced. In general play at your table, that's going to be a non-issue. There are some very low end dice that you can get, usually in bulk packs, that the weights are a little off, and that may become an issue with some of those. But generally, any of the bigger companies, they're going to be weighted just fine for your purposes. You'll also hear some shorthand being used when it comes to the polyhedral dice and role-playing games in general. You'll hear D4, D6, things like this. And the D just stands for die, and the number is how many sides it has. So a D10 is a die with 10 sides. You'll also hear come up when talking about dice is nat, a nat 20 or a nat 1, and that is just shorthand for natural. That means you rolled the dice, and before any modifiers, it was a natural 20 or a natural 1 is really the only two numbers you hear that used for. And especially in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, when you're making an attack roll, a natural 20 is an automatic success, and a natural 1 is an automatic failure. So let's get into it. Let's get into the individual dice. So we'll start out with the D20, the go-to die for most of your rolls other than determining damage. The D20 is used for all of your attack rolls, all of your saving throws, your checks, and for a lot of the miscellaneous rolls that may be made during the course of play, like random encounters and things like this. 95% of the time, when your dungeon master calls for a check, you're going to be rolling your 20-sided die. So if there's ever any doubt and you don't want to ask, chances are just grab your D20, roll it, and you'll be fine. The next largest die in your set is going to be the D12. The D12 is not used all that often. It's used for determining health for barbarians and for damage for the Great Axe and the Lance in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And all the classes and the weapons that we'll be going over when talking about the dice are for Dungeons & Dragons 5e. The next die in your set, the next largest, is the D10. The D10 is used for health for fighters, paladins, and rangers. So your upfront martial classes. It's used to determine damage for the battle axe and the longsword when they are being wielded two-handed. Also used for the glaive, halberds, pikes, heavy crossbows, and some other specialty weapons sometimes, if you're using firearms and things like that. The D10, to kind of keep in mind, the 0 on the tins, it represents the 10. The other numbers are just their numerical value. If you have a set of 7 or more dice, you'll also have in there a percentile die. And the percentile you won't use terribly often. It is only used for certain spells, very specific class abilities, and random tables. Dungeon Master is going to be using the percentile probably more than players will be. And to get the reading on your percentile, you roll the percentile die, which is a 10-sided die, but typically it has 2 numerals on each side. So you would give that a roll, and then you would roll your D10 to determine the ones position. So this is your tens position, this is your ones position. So for that, for the D10, the double zeros is typically 0 plus the other number, so that is 7. And if we did it again, that would be 23. Some people have a hard time determining what 100 would be, and that is if you come up all zeros at my table, that's generally what we accept as 100. And if you were to roll the 10 plus the 0, we generally look at that as being a 10. Next up, you have your D8. And the D8 is probably the most used, other than the 20. D8s determine the health for bards, clerics, druids, monks, rogues, and warlocks. It is used for the damage die for great clubs, spears and quarterstaffs, and tridents when they're being used two-handed. It's also used for light crossbow, for the battle axe and the long sword when they're being wielded with one hand. Flails, morning stars, rapiers, war picks, war hammers, and the longbow. Then you will have in your set your D6. The D6 determines the health for sorcerers and wizards. It's also used to determine your starting statistics. And for damage, it's used for the hand axe, javelins, mace, one-handed quarterstaff, one-handed spear, short bow, scimitar, short sword, one-handed trident, and the hand crossbow. You'll also be using 2 D6s for the damage for the great sword and the maul. You'll see a couple of varieties in the D6s. Some will have a numeral on it, and some will have spots. That's just, again, personal preference of which you prefer. Most of the polyhedral sets typically come with the numeral die. And lastly, in your set, you're going to have the D4, the 4-sided die. This is not used for health for any of the classes in 5th editions. It is used for damage for clubs, daggers, light hammers, sickles, darts, slings, and whips, and many times improvised weapons for certain races or classes, unarmed strikes. And sometimes the D4 has a little confusion in how to read it. Typically with these, with the kind of Chessex sets, The top number is the number that you rolled. So if you give it a roll, it is the top of the pyramid. For other sets, the numbers are laid out a little differently, and the number that you roll will be on the bottom. So for this, we got a 4. And that's, I think, where the confusion comes in. These dice are the easiest to lose and the most unpleasant to step on. And all of the dice will be used for various spells. We're not going to go into that in here. There's a whole lot of spells. In the spell description, it will tell you which die to use and how many. And other than the ones we've covered, you may come across some odd dice occasionally. There are 30-sided die, 50, 100-sided die. These are pretty rare, and in 5th edition, they don't really ever come up that I've seen. Occasionally, you will see a reference to a D3. I don't have one of those. I have seen some weird, funky shaped 3-sided die things. In my games, if a D3 is called for, we typically roll a D6, and if it's higher than 3, we just kind of count up again. So a 4 would be a 1, a 5 would be a 2, and the 6 would be the 3. And a D3, it very seldom comes up, but you will see it occasionally in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. The other kind of odd die that you may come across is a counter. Counters are used typically in some trading card games like Magic the Gathering, and they look very similar to a D20. They have 20 sides, but the numbers are laid out differently. The numbers go in sequential order. You can use these as a D20 if you want. Some say the probability is a little off with the counters because the numbers go in order, but for most tables, that's not going to be an issue. And I think that about covers it as far as the polyhedral dice go for role-playing games. Again, we were specifically talking about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. The same dice are used for pretty much the same things for Pathfinder. There are other role-playing games like the Doctor Who role-playing game, which only uses 6-sided dice. Savage Worlds is another popular system that uses almost all of the dice that we talked about, except for the 20-sided die. So it does kind of depend on the system you're using. But these are the standard. These are the sets you're going to find in your comic book stores, in your gaming stores, and like I mentioned in the beginning, in GameStops and things like this now. So if you have any questions about dice or want to share your preferences for which die you like more or which companies you prefer, drop them in the comments below. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe. If you want to get notifications for when a new video goes up, make sure to hit the little bell icon. And I think that's it for Polyhedral Dice. Until next time, happy trails, and thank you for watching Comics and Dragons.